Watkinson evening. At this suggestion the eyes of the young people sparkled, for they had become delighted with Mrs. St. Leonard, and imagined that a party at her house must be every way charming. Also, parties were novelties to both of them. "If possible we will do so," answered Mrs. Morland, "and with what pleasure I need not assure you. We leave New York tomorrow, but we shall return this way in September, and will then be exceedingly happy to see more of Mrs. St. Leonard." After a little more conversation Mrs. St. Leonard took her leave, repeating her hope of still seeing her new friends at her house that night, and enjoining them to let her know as soon as they returned to New York on their way home. Edward Morland handed her to her carriage, and then joined his mother and sister in their commendations of Mrs. St. Leonard, with whose exceeding beauty were united a countenance beaming with intelligence, and a manner that put every one at their ease immediately. "She is an evidence," said Edward, "how superior our women of fashion are to those of Europe." "Wait, my dear son," said Mrs. Morland, "till you have been in Europe, and had an opportunity of forming an opinion on that point, as on many others, from actual observation. For my part, I believe that in all civilized countries the upper classes of people are very much alike, at least in their leading characteristics." "Ah! Here comes the man that was sent to Mrs. Watkinson," said Caroline Morland. "I hope he could not find the house and has brought the note back with him. We shall then be able to go at first to Mrs. St. Leonard's, and pass the whole evening there." The man reported that he had found the house, and had delivered the note into Mrs. Watkinson's own hands, as she chanced to be crossing the entry when the door was opened, and that she read it immediately, and said very well. "Are you certain that you made no mistake in the house," said Edward, "and that you really did give it to Mrs. Watkinson?" "And it's quite sure I am, sir," replied the man. "When I first came over from the old country I lived with them a while, and though when she saw me today she did not let on that she remembered my doing that same, she could not help calling me James. Yes, the raw word she said when I handed her the billy ducks was, 'Very well, James.'" "Come, come," said Edward, when they found themselves alone, "let us look on the bright side. If we do not find a large party at Mrs. Watkinson's, we may in all probability meet some very agreeable people there, and enjoy the feast of reason and the flow of soul. We may find the Watkinson house so pleasant as to leave it with regret even for Mrs. St. Leonard's." "I do not believe Mrs. Watkinson is in fashionable society," said Caroline, "or Mrs. St. Leonard would have known her. I heard some of the ladies here talking last evening of Mrs. St. Leonard, and I found from what they said that she is among the elite of the light." "Even if she is," observed Mrs. Morland, "are polish of manners and cultivation of mind confined exclusively to persons of that class?" "Certainly not," said Edward. "The most talented and refined youth at our college, and he in whose society I found the greatest pleasure, was the son of a bricklayer." In the ladies' drawing-room, after dinner, the Morlands heard a conversation between several of the female guests, who all seemed to know Mrs. St. Leonard very well by reputation, and they talked of her party that was to come off gone this evening. "I hear," said one lady, "that Mrs. St. Leonard is to have an unusual number of lions." She then proceeded to name a gallant general, with his elegant wife and accomplished daughter, a celebrated commander in the Navy, 2 highly distinguished members of Congress, and even an ex-president. Also several of the most eminent among the American literati, and 2 first-rate artists. Edward Morland felt as if he could say, "Had I 3 ears I'd hear thee." Such a woman as Mrs. Street Leonard can always command the best lions that are to be found, observed another lady. And then, said a third, I have been told that she has such exquisite taste in lighting and embellishing her always elegant rooms. And her supper table, whether for summer or winter parties, is so beautifully arranged. All the viands are so delicious, and the attendance of the servants so perfect, and Mrs. Street Leonard does the honors with so much ease and tact. Some friends of mine that visit her, said a fourth lady, describe her parties as absolute perfection. She always manages to bring together those persons that are best fitted to enjoy each other's conversation. Still no one is overlooked or neglected. Then everything at her reunions is so well proportioned. She has just enough of music and just enough of whatever amusement may add to the pleasure of her guests, and still there is no appearance of design or management on her part. And better than all, said the lady who had spoken first, Mrs. Street Leonard is one of the kindest, most generous, and most benevolent of women. She does good in every possible way. I can listen no longer, said Caroline to Edward, rising to change her seat. If I hear any more I shall absolutely hate the Watkinsons. How provoking that they should have sent us the first invitation. If we had only thought of waiting till we could hear from Mrs. Street Leonard. For shame, Caroline, said her brother, how can you talk so of persons you have never seen, and to whom you ought to feel grateful for the kindness of their invitation, even if it has interfered with another party, that I must confess seems to offer unusual attractions. Now I have a presentiment that we shall find the Watkinson part of the evening very enjoyable. As soon as tea was over, Mrs. Morland and her daughter repaired to their toilettes. Fortunately, fashion as well as good taste has decided that, at a summer party, the costume of the ladies should never go beyond an elegant simplicity. Therefore our 2 ladies, in preparing for their intended appearance at Mrs. St. Leonard's, were enabled to attire themselves in a manner that would not seem out of place in the smaller company they expected to meet at the Watkinsons'. Over an underdress of lawn, Caroline Morland put on a white organdy trimmed with lace, and decorated with bows of pink ribbon. At the back of her head was a wreath of fresh and beautiful pink flowers, tied with a similar ribbon. Mrs. Morland wore a black grenadine over a satin, and a lace cap trimmed with white. It was but 9:15 o'clock when their carriage stopped at the Watkinson door. The front of the house looked very dark. Not a ray gleamed through the Venetian shutters, and the glimmer beyond the fanlight over the door was almost imperceptible. After the coachman had rung several times, an Irish girl opened the door, cautiously, as Irish girls always do, and admitted them into the entry, where one light only was burning in a branch lamp. "Shall we go upstairs?" said Mrs. Morland. "And what for would ye go upstairs?" said the girl in a pert tone. "It's all dark there, and there's no preparations. Ye can lave your things here hanging on the rack." "It is a party ye're expecting?" "Blessed are them what expects nothing."